I'm making my own kitbashed versions of every miniature from each faction from the Trench Crusade Kickstarter. In my previous video, I constructed an entire new Antioch warband with bits from Wargames Atlantic, Perry Miniatures, and North Star figures. In this video, I'm updating a bunch of old minis I had in my collection to make the first half of my Heretic Legion warband. We're going to be starting off with the Heretic Troopers, the backbone force of the Heretic Legion. I had a sprue of Wargame Atlantic World War I Germans. They have a lot of great little details, but to make them a bit more grimdark, I wanted to give them a big plate metal chest piece. To do this, I'm using epoxy sculpt and pressing the compound directly into the figure's torso. The basic shape of the plates are lined up with an X-Acto knife, and when the epoxy sculpt dries, it will be sanded and carved to refine the edges. The back of the armor was tapered down to the belt to make the armor slightly sleeker. Then some weapons and heads were selected and glued into place. They weren't really giving off that Trench Crusade vibe, so I tried experimenting with some North Star Cultist arms and weapons. I was still unhappy, so I went back to my 15-year-old copy of Dust Tactics. There are some standard Germans that are slightly bigger and more dynamic than the Wargame Atlantic ones I had been working with. The Dust figure heads are removed super easily, which pretty much says everything you need to know about this game. Also their hands and weapons, which are then traded with the previous miniatures. Superglue was enough to hold the weapons in place, but a little bit of epoxy sculpt was needed to make a better joint for the new heads. I think I made the right choice. These new Heretics are more formidable looking, and their armor looks much better than what I was sculpting. The overall minis were looking good, so it was on to the smaller details. I pressed out some epoxy sculpt as thin as I could, and cut it short to be capes to cover any of the details I didn't like on their backs. Now, looking at some reference art, a lot of them show the troopers with this big metal plate with some runes drawn on it. I'm not sure if this is some of that Hell Factory satanic metal armor from the lore or a decorative brooch for their capes, but I made mine out of super sculpty clay. The rune glyph was carved into the clay with the X-Acto blade. I was able to make each one smaller than the last. The clay gets tossed into the oven at 275 degrees. Not quite as hot as Hellfire, but it's enough to make it harden. Then it gets super glued down. Another detail I wanted to add from Mike Francina's art was the baby attached to this guy's belt, which was the style at the time. I have some really tiny HO scale pedestrian minis, and used one for the baby's head, cutting away the rest of it until it was like this Game of Life peg. I made the rest of the body with epoxy sculpt. There wasn't much of a plan here. I was just hoping to get the shape of some arms and legs, but it kind of ended up looking like a gummy bear. Once it dried, it was super glued down, along with some knives and grenades. These minis have been sitting in my closet for 15 years, and now they have been given a facelift and updated for one of the most popular games of 2025. I think that's really cool, and pretty much what Trench Crusade means to me. Just make something cool with what you have available. Speaking of what you have available, I have this evil witch from the Zombicide Black Plague Kickstarter. The mini never got any paint, because the details are pretty soft. But the flow of the dress looks pretty good, and she's already kinda in that artillery witch pose. Start by chopping off her head and adding a piece of epoxy sculpt to give me an idea of where the artillery witch's ruff will land. Now to get some really thin layers, I'm rolling the epoxy sculpt out in between two sheets of parchment paper. The parchment paper will prevent the putty from sticking to my tools and allow me to peel it off easily. I'm not really worried about how it looks, I'm just trying to fill the gaps and build up the top part of the witch's clothing. I keep adding layers to fill up her back and add volume to the cloak. At this point, I tried my hand at sculpting the ruff, but that wasn't happening. It did, however, help me realize that the arm was in the way and would have to be replaced. But first I added a new layer of epoxy sculpt to work as the outside layer of the cloak. All the previous layers help give this one some wrinkles and folds, while also working as supports to keep everything held together. I found an STL file for a ruff on Thingiverse and printed it. And the artillery itself was a bomb taken from a 1/76 scale Airfix set. A nasty mold line had to be removed, and I drilled a hole at the bottom and inserted a wire. The new arm was taken from my set of Warlord Games Roman veterans. These are nice because they have no sleeves or armor on them, and this one has its hand slightly open to grasp a javelin or staff. The arm gets pressed into another thin layer of epoxy sculpt to give me a nice joint for gluing, and the 3D printed rough is dry fitted to make sure the new arm has enough room. The final piece of epoxy sculpt is cut and draped over the arm to look like it's coming out of the cloak. Next I needed a head and looked for one on the North Star Cultist sprue. A hole was drilled into the rough and the head was glued down. To open the Roman javelin hand, I carefully scored the front and back of the palm so that it could be folded open. I then used the super glue and baking soda trick to strengthen the hand. I could now drill a hole in it to fit the width of the wire inside of the bomb. But before it was glued down, I added some horn-like things to the cultist head and continued the wrinkle texture from the back of the neck on them. This made her look super gross, but that's a good thing in Trench Crusade. The finishing touches were some fiery effects sculpted on the bomb, and the artillery ridge was done. Next up was the Heretic Priest. Unfortunately, the official miniature is one of my least favorites of the entire line, as I prefer the one from the rulebook art much more. There is something creepy about the lankiness of the character that makes it unsettling. It reminds me of a lot of the Mouth of Sauron from the Lord of the Rings movies. I played with the idea of using a Warhammer Chaos Chosen, but it was just too big and bulky to be a priest. Maybe later that mini can become a Hell Knight or something. I did end up deciding on the Warrior Priest mini from 1490 Doom. The Bureau Games team was kind enough to send me the official STLs for their minis, and I had been experimenting with my 3D printer settings to get the best results in FDM. Needless to say, I have a lot of these priest bodies laying around. And if you want to get your own version of this mini, consider backing the 1490 Doom Kickstarter. It's currently going on right now. To Trench Crusade up this priest, I start by chopping off his head and removing the respirator and hose line. I looked for a head on the North Star Cultist sprue that could look similar to the artillery witch and the Mouth of Sauron. I filled in the hole left from removing the respirator with epoxy sculpt, making sure to continue the folds and seams of the fabric. Neck armor and shoulder pads were made with the remaining putty and detailed with my X-Acto knife. Once dry, the new armor could be sharpened with my knife to make it look more angular and imposing. At this point, the head could be attached and I wanted to extend it upwards. The shoulder pads were also extended. Leftover compound was used to make the priest base. A glob was pressed into a 32mm base, and skulls from Games Workshop were each piled up and pushed into the epoxy sculpt. There are even some bigger orc heads to break it up a bit. They could be skulls from communicants or demons or something like that. I was still struggling with the priest's hat until I decided to invert the triangle and make his head look more like horns. This had sort of a ceremonial look to it, and made the priest seem more important. He also looked really familiar to something and was driving me crazy who he looked like. Maybe future me while editing remembers and can put it up on the screen. Then all I had to do was attach a banner spear from a Victrix Viking, and that cultist hand from the arm I almost used with the Heretic Troopers. Then, using all of my artistic skills and sculpting ability, I made a snake, easily the hardest thing I have done so far. Last up is the Warwolf, an armor-clad monster capable of smashing through the barbed wire of the front lines. The only giant wolf miniature I can think of, let alone own, is the Abomination from the Zombicide Black Plague expansion Wolfsburg. All those Zombicide stretch goals finally finding a use. It's not hoarding if you plan on using it for something. I start by chopping off the wolf's lower jaw and tail. Then a new head is made out of epoxy sculpt. I try to keep it long and narrow, but also thick enough so it won't be weak. I also want to maintain that curved opening of the mouth like in the artwork. I felt pretty good about how this dolphin-looking head was going, so I left it to dry. With the excess epoxy sculpt, some of the wolf's organic details were cut away, and the putty was added on top. This will make a smoother surface, better for gluing additional pieces to. After that first layer dries, I scrape away the rounded parts to make it look more angular like plates of armor. I used the opportunity to carve some detail into the head, and added this groove to the jawline. Next, using some .02 thick polystyrene sheet, I cut small rectangles and glued them to the wolf's back to be some ramshackled armor plates. I had a 15mm Flames of War Panzer tank sprue, and I took this small piece of tread and attached it to the wolf's lower back to look like a cybernetic spinal cord. There was also tank armor plates that I cut up and used alongside the plasticard. Then some angled plasticard pieces were cut and warped to be the wolf's gauntlets. The super glue bond is much stronger on the smooth epoxy sculpt than if it had been glued to the uneven fur texture of the wolf. This extra peri-buckler was glued to one of the wolf's arms to look like some big mechanical joint. Now it was time to give the wolf its chainsaw teeth, and to do this I found an old Space Marine chainsword. I feel pretty weird using it, since the sprue's from 1998, but it fits with the rest of the troops being upscaled from old minis, so in it goes. I was able to get both top and bottom rows of teeth with one sword, and I very carefully cut a groove in the epoxy sculpt for the pieces. It took me like 15 minutes to make the groove. I really didn't want to break the head. I also made an effort to keep the tiny rivets at the end of the saw blade, to give the warwolf some nice detail textures. Then a new layer of epoxy sculpt was added to fill the gaps between the wolf armor plates, as well as blending in the spinal cord and making a second plate. The head will get grinded down and smoothed out once the new layer dries. This mini has some really cool tubes and cables hanging off its jaw, and it really adds a disturbing look to the creature's profile. A main pipe was taken from my last Dust Tactics heavy weapons troop. An old USB cord was stripped for its wires. The big tube was easily attached under the wolf's jaw, but I had to use some 332-inch plastic tube, cut thin to work as adapters for the USB wires. The plastic tubes are attached all around the underside of the wolf, and the wires plugged into it and glued down. With the wires in place, some more polystyrene armor plates were added to the wolf's head. And some really thin pieces were used to make that Freddy Krueger-style claw gauntlet for the front paws. The final layer of epoxy sculpt was used to blend everything together and fill the gaps. And the last piece of detail was using some 1/16-inch plastic rod, cut super thin to be giant rivets used to bolt the wolf's armor down. Super happy with this one. I wasn't a fan of the pose, but adding the pipes and wires really helps add additional textures that are all blended together with the wolf's reaching, lunging posture. So let's get painting. A good resource for picking a color palette is coolers.com. It randomly generates 5 color palettes and will help limit the amount of colors used to keep the troops drab and muddy. I wanted a bluish-gray palette with some good complementary accent colors. With my palette picked out, all the minis were primed black, and a dark blue-gray was put down first. The other colors were blocked in, and true metallics were used for metals. This blue stain for Panzer Gray from AK Interactive was thinned down with mineral spirits and washed over the entire miniature. Any excess can be cleaned up with more mineral spirits. The Warwolf, though, was stained with streaking grime, brown instead. I then go over everything with a highlight layer, and a piece of sponge is used to stipple muddy browns on the cloaks and robes, as well as some metallic highlights to all metal. A basing mix of caulk dirt, grout, and water is mixed up and covered over the bases. And then these troops were ready to unleash hell on the front lines. I'm off to a good start with half of the Heretic Legion completed. I like the troopers, especially since I was able to find a use for these dust figures. But I'm still not 100% happy with the Heretic Priest. But it's hard to be upset when I was able to make this show-stealing Warwolf. In the next episode, I'll be finishing this warband once I figure out how the hell I'm going to make a Cinder.